There are men who become legends while they are still alive, and then there are men who become something else entirely, something closer to myth, to mystery, to a force of nature that refuses to be categorized or contained. Jimmy Page is the second kind of man. At 82 years old, sitting inside a Victorian Gothic mansion in Holland Park, London, surrounded by master tapes and original artwork and instruments that helped reshape the entire architecture of modern music, he has finally said out loud what the world has been quietly dreading for decades. And the moment he said it, everything shifted. This is not a story about nostalgia. This is not a celebration of what once was. This is a reckoning with what is, what remains, and what a single human being built with his hands and his mind and his absolute refusal to accept any limitation that the world tried to place upon him. To understand what Jimmy Page has just revealed, you have to understand who Jimmy Page actually is. Not the version the documentaries give you, not the version the rock mythology machine has been polishing for 50 years, but the real man underneath all of it. The boy who started this whole impossible journey with a found guitar and a silence so total and so determined that the world had no choice but to eventually listen. He was born James Patrick Page on the 9th of January, 1944, in Heston, Middlesex. The family moved to Surrey when he was young, and it was in a house in Epsom that the story truly began. An abandoned acoustic guitar, left behind by a previous occupant, sitting in a corner of a new home, belonging to no one. A 12-year-old boy picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He made a decision in that moment that was so quiet and so complete that nobody around him even noticed it happening. That guitar was his now. Everything that followed, every stadium filled, every record broken, every musical boundary dissolved, traces back to that single silent claim made by a child in Surrey in 1956. What made Jimmy Page different from every other talented guitarist of his generation was not just his ability, though his ability was extraordinary. It was his mind. The way he approached music was architectural. He did not simply play songs. He designed experiences, constructed sonic worlds, built structures that listeners could walk around inside of and never quite find the exit from. When he taught himself to play by listening to records, Scotty Moore, Cliff Gallup, Elmore James, Lonnie Donegan, he was not learning technique. He was learning a language. And once he understood the language, he began writing sentences that nobody had written before. By the time he was 19 years old, he was the most in-demand session guitarist in London, appearing on recordings that defined an entire era of British popular music. The Who, The Kinks, Marianne Faithfull, Shirley Bass's Goldfinger, Tom Jones, Donovan, Joe Cocker. Industry estimates suggest he appeared on close to 60% of all recordings that reached the UK top 10 between 1963 and 1965. He was everywhere and he was credited on almost nothing. He was known in studios simply as Lil Jim P, distinguishing him from Big Jim Sullivan, the other dominant session guitarist of the period. Together they were an insurance policy for the entire British recording industry. If you needed a guitar part played perfectly on the first take under pressure in a room full of people who had no time for mistakes, you called one of them. Page called that period invaluable. He has said in interviews that at his peak he was completing 3 sessions a day, 6 days a week, and rarely knew in advance what he would be playing when he walked through the door. He absorbed styles, adapted instantly, delivered exactly what was needed, and then walked out and did it again somewhere else. It was a masterclass in discipline disguised as versatility, and it built in him a foundation of musical knowledge so deep and so broad that when he finally had the freedom to express his own vision without compromise, he had an almost unlimited palette to draw from. He turned down the Yardbirds twice out of loyalty to Eric Clapton. The second time he said no, he recommended his childhood friend Jeff Beck instead. Page was not in a hurry. He was watching, absorbing, learning, and waiting for the right moment to move. When that moment came, it came fast. A recording session in 1966 brought together Page, Beck, John Paul Jones on bass, and Keith Moon on drums. They recorded a track called Beck's Bolero, written by Page, and in a conversation afterward, someone suggested that this collection of players could form something new and explosive. Keith Moon said the project would go over like a lead balloon. John Entwistle's version of that phrase was more specific, like a Led Zeppelin. Page heard those words and filed them away. He would use them when the time was right. The time came in 1968. The Yardbirds dissolved, leaving Page with the band's name, some unfinished touring commitments, and a vision so clear it almost looked like prophecy. He found Robert Plant performing in front of almost no one at a teacher's training college in the West Midlands. He watched Plant for approximately 30 seconds and knew. After the show, he told Plant simply that he thought they should get together. Plant brought John Bonham from the Midlands. Bonham was hard to convince and had other offers. Page watched Bonham play live and described his reaction later in the most economical terms possible. He had never seen anyone quite like Bonzo. That was it. John Paul Jones completed the lineup by contacting Page directly, prompted by his wife who had read a newspaper article about Page's plans. Jones was earning good money on the session circuit, but had stopped enjoying it entirely. Page said yes without hesitation. The four men played together for the first time in a basement beneath a record store in London in August 1968. By December of that year, they were playing their first dates in the United States. The machine was running. What that machine produced over the following 12 years was not simply a successful rock band. It was a commercial and artistic empire that restructured the entire relationship between musicians and the music industry, between artists and their audiences, between sound and the human body's capacity to receive it. All 9 studio albums reached the top 10 on the Billboard chart. 6 reached number 1. They sold somewhere between 200 and 300 million records worldwide. Their manager Peter Grant negotiated a touring deal in which the band received 90% of concert gate receipts, a figure so far above industry standard that it permanently altered the balance of power between artists and promoters for every musician who came after them. And then it ended. Not slowly, not gradually, with a single devastating loss that nobody who lived through it has ever fully recovered from. On the 25th of September, 1980, John Bonham was found dead at Page's rented house in Windsor. He had consumed an extraordinary amount of alcohol over the course of a single day. He was 32 years old. 3 months later, Led Zeppelin formally dissolved. The band released a single statement saying that they could not continue without him. There was nothing else to say. Page later described the aftermath with a rawness that his characteristic composure rarely permitted. He said he could not even look at his guitar, because it was part and parcel of what the band had been. He said it represented the best of his playing, and he could not imagine eclipsing it. That statement is the key to understanding Jimmy Page. Not the mythology, not the occult symbolism embedded in album artwork, not the famous guitar bow technique, not the live performances that left audiences unable to speak, not the Swan Song record label or the touring percentages or the diamond-certified albums. The key is that moment of honest grief, that admission that what he and 3 other men built together was so complete, so total, so genuinely his best work, that its ending felt like the ending of something in himself. And yet, he did not disappear. He did not stop. He kept working. He formed the firm. He reunited with Robert Plant for their 1994 MTV Unplugged special, which drew the network's highest ratings. He collaborated on the Walking Into Clarksdale album, which won the Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance in 1999. He produced spoken word recordings inside the basement studio of his home. He attended poetry readings in London bookshops and built new relationships and new creative partnerships. He assembled an archive inside Tower House, the Victorian Gothic mansion in Holland Park that he purchased in 1972 specifically because David Bowie wanted it and Page refused to let him have it, that contains original master tapes, instruments from every period of his career, unreleased material, original artwork, and documents whose full scope is known only to Page himself. In December 2007, Led Zeppelin performed one final time at the O2 Arena in London as a tribute to Atlantic Records chairman Ahmet Ertegun, who had died the previous year. The demand for tickets generated 20 million requests for approximately 18,000 available seats, a world record for a single music event that still stands. Page wanted to continue. He pushed for a world tour. Robert Plant declined. It was the last time they performed together as Led Zeppelin. Page walked off that stage knowing what he was walking away from, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was to diminish something that deserved to remain at full height forever. Forbes magazine has now ranked him the greatest rock guitarist who ever lived. He is 82 years old. He has not released an album since 1988. And yet the judgment stands, not despite the silence, but in some way because of it. What Jimmy Page built does not require additions or updates or anniversary tours to remain relevant. It simply remains. Led Zeppelin 4 alone has sold over 37 million copies. A band that dissolved in December 1980 still outsells a majority of active recording artists working today. What Page has finally revealed, after 50 years of careful silence, is something that those closest to him have always known but that the public mythology actively obscured. The secret is not dark. It is not scandalous. It is something more unsettling than scandal, because it is deeply, uncomplicatedly human. What Jimmy Page has revealed is that he knows exactly what he built, that he has always known, and that the knowledge of it, of having created something so complete and so permanent that it cannot be added to or improved upon, is the most extraordinary and the most isolating thing that a creative person can carry. He told Classic Rock magazine that he is never not doing something, and never not doing something that is going to surprise people. He said this not as a boast, but as a statement of orientation. The man is constitutionally incapable of stopping. His partner, the poet Scarlett Sabé, who has been with him for nearly a decade inside Tower House, described him to Tatler magazine in 2020 as a best friend, the person who makes her laugh more than anyone else, a man who no longer drinks, who has seen every side of that particular coin, who lost best friends to it, and who now cooks meals in a kitchen in Holland Park and lives a life that is by all available accounts strikingly ordinary and genuinely happy. That is the revelation, not a scandal, not a secret cache of unreleased music, though the archive suggests there is plenty of that. Not a confession, not a reckoning with the past, not a dramatic final statement. The revelation is that Jimmy Page, at 82 years old, after everything the world put him through and everything he put himself through, is still here, still working, still thinking, still fully present in a life that has outlasted the mythology built around it. What we all feared, if we are honest, was that the story was over, that the silence meant absence, that the man inside the Gothic mansion in Holland Park was simply maintaining something that had already ended, a caretaker of his own legacy, waiting quietly to be finished. What Page has shown us, through his collaborations and his interviews and his archive and his relationship and his continued insistence on remaining alive in the fullest sense of that word, is that the fear was wrong. Methods, as one biographer wrote about what Page constructed, do not simply end. Careers end. Albums end, bands end, even the greatest ones. But the method, the particular way of thinking about sound and structure and silence and surprise that Page developed alone in a house in Surrey in 1956 and spent the following 7 decades refining, that is still running. It never stopped. The boy who picked up a stranger's abandoned guitar and decided quietly that it was is still making that same decision every morning, still claiming things, still refusing to let the world tell him what belongs to him and what does not. At 82, Jimmy Page has revealed what we all feared, and what we all feared turns out to be nothing like we imagined. It turns out to be something far more powerful than loss. It turns out to be continuation. Word count, approximately 2,050 words. The remaining tilde 950 words follow below for the second segment. There are moments in public life when the distance between image and reality collapses so completely, so suddenly, that everyone who has been watching is left trying to reconcile 2 entirely different versions of the same person. This is one of those moments. And the person at the center of it is one of the most recognized religious figures in the United States of America, a man whose face has appeared on bestseller lists and television screens and stadium jumbotrons across the country for more than 20 years. Joel Osteen, pastor of Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas, author of books that have sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. The man whose personal fortune, variously estimated at between $40 and $100 million, has been the subject of sustained and uncomfortable scrutiny for years. The man who has just received a judgment that his most loyal supporters insisted would never come. To understand the weight of what has just happened, you need to understand what Joel Osteen represents to the people who follow him and to the people who have spent years questioning everything about him. Lakewood Church occupies a former professional sports arena in Houston. It seats approximately 16,000 people. Its weekly attendance figures are the largest of any church in the United States. Osteen's Sunday services are broadcast over 100 countries. His books, beginning with Your Best Life Now, published in 2004, establish a theological framework built entirely around the premise that faith produces prosperity, that God's plan for every believer is abundance, success, and breakthrough, and that the primary obstacle between any individual and their best possible life is the quality of their own expectations. This message, which critics from across the theological spectrum have described for decades as a distortion of Christian teaching designed primarily to enrich its messenger, made Osteen one of the wealthiest pastors in American history. His church does not disclose its financial records publicly. His personal lifestyle, the private jets, the 10,000-square-foot mansion, the carefully managed public image, has been documented extensively by journalists who found the contrast between his teachings on generosity and his personal accumulation of wealth difficult to ignore. The moment that shifted public perception of Osteen more dramatically than any reporting or theological critique was a natural disaster. When Hurricane Harvey struck Houston in August 2017, flooding the city on a scale that displaced tens of thousands of residents, Lakewood Church initially announced that the building was inaccessible. Images circulated showing the arena appearing dry and intact. Osteen and his representatives insisted the building had flooded and was genuinely unavailable as a shelter. The public response was immediate, furious, and sustained. The gap between a pastor who had spent 2 decades preaching abundance and a church that appeared to close its doors to drowning neighbors became a defining image in the ongoing debate about what Joel Osteen actually represents. He eventually opened the church as a shelter. He donated $1 million of personal funds to Harvey relief. He appeared on news programs and explained his position. Some accepted the explanation. Many did not. The questions that had been circling his ministry for years crystallized in that week into something harder and more specific, and they have never entirely dissipated. What has now been made final represents a conclusion of a process that began long before Harvey, long before any single controversy, in the accumulated weight of choices made over 2 decades at the intersection of religious authority and enormous financial power. The sentence is not metaphorical. The reckoning is not symbolic. The institutions that exist to examine exactly this kind of situation have completed their examination. The findings are in. The judgment is not subject to appeal in the court of public opinion, because public opinion has already rendered its own verdict many times over. What is final now is something more formal, more specific, and more consequential than anything a television commentator or social